Good morning, everyone. I can see people are still joining, so I have an introduction to do anyway. So welcome to everybody. Welcome to the Australian Centre for Federalism's inaugural Brazil update. This is co-hosted by ANCLAS, the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies at the ANU. My name is Tracy Fenwick. I'm the director of the Australian Centre for Federalism, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Politics and International Relations of CAS at the ANU. First of all, I'd also like to do a welcome to country, acknowledging the Ngunnawal people on whose land I am currently sitting, and thanks to elders past and present. So today, three of us are going to do a roundtable talk. I'm going to do a quick brief introduction, and then I'm going to introduce our other two experts. I'm also a researcher of comparative federalism and an expert of Brazilian politics. I personally specialize on the politics of redistribution, and specifically I research the politics of large social programs like Bolsa Familia, which has been renamed Auxílio Brasil under the previous Bolsonaro government. So I'm going to tell you the order of events. First of all, I'm going to quickly set the context of the Brazilian elections, which we're discussing today. And then, as I said, I'm going to introduce our expert guests, followed by a very brief introduction of Brazilian politics, which I think Thiago is also going to talk about when he presents the results. Thiago is going to virtually present us the actual results, and then we're going to have a deeper roundtable analysis between the three of us. And there's going to be lots of time for moderated question and answer in the chat box. So if you have questions as you go along, feel free to put it in the chat box, and then we'll get to it and we'll try to go through it together. So I'm going to just set the basic context of the elections. We're never sure when we do events like this how many people already know a lot about Brazilian politics and elections and what's going on. So I'll just do a quick little rundown. So we have several important issues to discuss today with our invited experts, and we're principally going to talk about the future governing challenges and the path forwards for Brazilian government and society. So as most of you, I'm sure, are aware, following the second round of Brazil's general elections in late October, Brazil's former President Lula Inácio da Silva of the leftist Workers' Party, the PT, who governed Brazil from 2003 to 2010, which was a period of impressive social inclusion and economic growth in Brazil, is reassuming the Brazilian presidency on the 1st of January 2023. The context of Lula's victory, however, and the Brazil which he will have to govern is very different from that of 2003. First of all, the parties of the left unified to form a broad coalition to defeat the contentious right-of-center incumbent Jair Bolsonaro in the 2022 elections. Lula's former rival, Geraldo Alckmin, will notably assume the vice presidency with Lula in January. And secondly, the Brazilian economy has not seen growth for over the past decade. And third, Brazilian society and its territory is more polarized and divided than ever before. And fourth, the previous government effectively dismantled the professionalization and the neutrality of the Brazilian state, impacting both public policy and its processes. So the context sets a lot of challenges for the future administration. So here to discuss these issues today with me is Professor Osvaldo Amaral. Osvaldo is a professor at the Department of Political Science and the director of the Public Opinion Study Center, CISOP, at the State University of Campinas, Unicampi. He has been a visiting professor at the University of Salamanca, visiting researcher at the universities of Oxford and Notre Dame. Between 2013 and 2017, he was also the coordinator of the research group on political parties and party systems of the Latin American Political Science Association. And he has published several books and articles specifically about the Workers' Party, the PT, the Brazilian party system, party organization, and electoral behavior. Bem-vindo, Osvaldo, who's joining us live from Brazil.
Thank you very much, Tracy and Thiago, for the invitation. It's great to be here. And I think, well, I haven't known Tracy for like Professor Fenwick for like 15 years, and I think it's our first panel together. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And second joining us, Thiago Nascimento da Silva, who has recently joined. He's a new colleague of mine, so I'm looking forward to knowing you, Thiago, for the next 15 years. He's recently joined the ANU School of Politics and International Relations just in 2022. Prior to coming to the ANU, Thiago was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Mannheim, Germany. His research focuses on comparative politics with an emphasis on political institutions and political economy. Thiago's research has addressed the dynamics of coalition governments in presidential and parliamentary democracies, policy-making processes, and political and economic inequalities. In his recent research, Thiago also examines the consequences of coalition governments on voter behavior and party competition, and the role of the opposition on coalition governance. Bem-vindo, Thiago, who is joining us live from Germany.
Yes, thank you so much, Tracy, for putting this webinar together and for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure to share this event with Osvaldo. So thanks so much for the invitation again.
Okay, so as I said to everybody, lucky for us today, we kind of have a de facto expert about Lula's previous governing style in the PT, which is Osvaldo, among other things, and an expert of how the opposition best plays its role within Brazil's unique style of presidentialism. So for those of you that are new to Brazilian coalition presidentialism, which we're going to talk about in detail today, I just want to flag a few things before we start so you can understand maybe the context of what we're talking about. So Brazilian presidentialism is driven by complex multi-party coalitions that are really necessary to govern because of the amount of political parties that are represented. So it's the complex multi-party coalitions that are necessary to govern are also coalitions which induce both state and local party machines and opposition groups to realign normally after an election into multi-party electoral alliances and governing coalitions at all three levels, federal, state, and municipal. These coalitions are largely driven by a large number of nominations to administrative posts and interbranch relations, both horizontal and vertical. And this is typical of the separation of powers in presidentialism and federalism. So hopefully we can get into this later. We might not have time, but multi-level governance is also a critical constraint on the power of the Brazilian presidency. So as I said, the context this year is quite different, and the transition, I believe, has already begun. So first of all, I'd like to go over to Thiago, who's going to virtually present us the actual results and show it to them. And then we're going to delve into a deeper analysis regarding future outlooks and governing challenges. So Thiago, over to you.
Okay, so I will first share my screen here, and then you let me know if you can see it.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. So I will present, as Tracy mentioned, 4 slides with the Brazilian general election results for different offices that were up for competition in 2022. So this first slide here shows the results for the president. So Brazil has a 2-round majority system for the president. So this is the map of Brazil. And here we have the vote share for president in the second round by municipality. So we can see that in the aggregate, the candidate Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or simply Lula from the Workers' Party, PT, won the election with approximately 51% of the votes, while Jair Bolsonaro from the Liberal Party, PL, finished in second with 49% of the votes. Now, the results for governors. So here we have the map depicting the parties that elected governors by state. Brazil has 26 states and 1 federal district. In some 11 parties elected governors in the 2022 elections, and the distribution of the elected governors is depicted in the legend below the map here. Third slide is in 2022, Brazil also had elections for the legislature of the country, and Brazil has a bicameral legislature. So here we can see the composition of the lower house to start in 2023. Later, we will talk about how fragmented the Brazilian legislature is. And finally, the composition of the Brazilian upper house to start in 2023. We can see that in the 2022 elections, voters elected 1/3 of the Brazilian Senate seats, and the distribution of seats is depicted in the legend below the figure. I pass back to you, Tracy. I will stop sharing.
Okay, so obviously the big question, which both of you are gonna have lots of time to address, is really the critical issue of governability. So I guess what I'm most curious about, that I'll start with you, Thiago, is how is Lula going to create a coalition going forward in this very different context from 2003? And I think the principal question is, as you said, there's 14 pro-Bolsonaro states, but then there's also, I think, based on his coalition, 11 governors who are also allies of Bolsonaro. So do you have what are your thoughts in terms of January 1st, how he's going to build a governing coalition?
Yeah, so Lula has not one, but several challenges ahead, right? And let's focus on the challenge of forming a government first. So once the elections are over, horse trading inevitably begins, right, between elites to determine how the government will be formed and which portfolios will be allocated to the parties that will comprise the coalition and bring legislative support to the executive government. So like all other presidents since Brazil's redemocratization in the 1980s, Lula will need to find partners to form a majority coalition and succeed in advancing the policy agenda he promised to his voters. So the first challenge is that besides the current division at the voter level in Brazil, we can talk about this polarization later, there is also a division in the Brazilian political elite. So I will share again my screen because then I can show to you that figure that I talked earlier. So this figure here, Brazil has the most fragmented legislature in the world. We can see these with this figure here that shows the number of parties with representation. Actually is this figure here, sorry. The number of parties with representation in the lower house, in the bars, and the line depicts the effective number of parties. So as you can see, in 2018, we had 30 political parties in the legislature, in the lower house, and we achieved the maximum value for the fragmentation in the world with 16 political parties. So see that with the parliamentary elections of 2022, the number of parties with representation in the federal legislature and the number of effective parties actually decreased in Brazil. This is due to some recent changes in the electoral laws that we can analyze later. The fact is that even with this reduction in the number of parties, the Brazilian legislature remains quite fragmented. So we can go back to here. So in the legislature to start in 2023, the largest party is the PL, the Liberal Party, this is the current party of Bolsonaro. Then we have PT, the president's party, and at least 5 other political parties with more than 40 seats in the lower house. To reach a minimum legislative majority, the coalition formed by Lula will have to hold at least 262 seats. But unlike parliamentary democracies, in presidential democracies, the discipline of the parties that comprise the coalition is usually below 90%. So I believe that the coalition formed by Lula will be the type that we call a surplus coalition. That is a majority government that comprises more parties than are strictly necessary to control the majority of the legislative seats. And given the current composition of the lower house, I believe that the government coalition will be composed of between 8 and 10 political parties. So the preeminent question becomes what parties will support Lula's government, right? In fact, as mentioned by Tracy, there are several pro-Bolsonaro states and a strong opposition representation in Congress. However, we cannot disregard, I believe, 2 important things when answering this question. The first one is Lula's political and negotiation capacity. And second is the ideological fluidity of political parties that together form a group called in Brazil, the big center. So talking about the first factor, during the electoral campaign, Lula was able to unite around him a large democratic front composed by even some opponents of Lula in the past. So the vice president of Lula, as Tracy said, for example, Geraldo Alckmin, now in the PSB party, was a leader of the main opposition party to Lula in the last 30 years, the Brazilian Social Democracy Party. And second, focusing on the political parties that comprise the legislature, we have seen in recent weeks that the leaders of several parties that could be considered opposition during the electoral campaigns, during the elections, and have guaranteed representation in the Brazilian legislature are now open to talking and negotiating with Lula. So for example, the current president of the lower chamber, Arthur Lira from the PP, was the first to recognize the electoral results that Lula won. And he has already signaled that he wants Lula's support for his re-election as the president of the lower chamber. So in addition to that, with parties under pressure with the new electoral rules, such as the new electoral threshold, we might see some parties merging. So for example, the União Brasil party is negotiating with the PP for a merger, and there are indications from these parties' leaders that they are open to being part of a future coalition government. So these parties will add up to more than 100 seats, forming the largest representation in the lower chamber. The MDB is also a strong candidate to join the coalition government and could merge with the party Podemos. Together, they will have 54 seats. So from all of these, I believe that the main opposition party will in fact be Bolsonaro's current party, the PL, with the current largest representation with 99 seats. But PL alone will not prevent Lula from composing a coalition with a legislative majority.
Thanks, Thiago. So Osvaldo, I'd kind of like to bring you in here because the way Thiago's painted it, and as we've discussed before, you know, it kind of sounds like Brazilian politics as usual, that in the post-election context, Lula has to form a coalition. For those in the audience that don't know, post-election party switching is common in Brazil. So what happens is parties that were maybe not in the electoral coalition, when Lula forms a government, traditionally in Brazil, parties, smaller parties, come into the governing coalition in the post-election context by joining the governing coalition. So in Brazil, the electoral coalition is different than the governing coalition. But Osvaldo, the question I wanted to ask you, and maybe you can tell the audience a bit, is that the way I understand it is that the extent of anti-petismo in Brazil and in some of the smaller parties is going to be a constraint to those what we normally see is Brazilian politics, the way coalitions normally. So maybe you could tell the audience a little bit how Lula normally would build a coalition, and if you think that there's going to be some differences this time around, and bringing in a little bit, maybe for the audience, a little bit way of understanding the extent of anti-petismo, and if you think that that will be a constraint in this government as opposed to previously.
Okay. Well, first, I think that obviously Lula will have to build a coalition. You have to, to bring parties to have the majority, to pass new laws, to pass constitutional amendments. And I think they have learned from the beginning of their first government in 2003, when they had a minority government. And it was really, really hard to pass the bills, and they had to bargain with specific parties, like ad hoc bargains, to pass certain bills, such as the pension reforms. And after that, they had the scandals to get the support in the Congress, known as Mensalão. So I think, and when you look at the transition process right now, I think they are trying to bring as most parties as they can. Right, as Thiago mentioned, there are some parties that are probably not going to be in the coalition. The Liberal Party, the party of the president of this party said yesterday that he's going to be in the opposition. So there's going to be probably an opposition, but some of the deputies, as I was saying, they may switch the party to another party supporting the government when they have the window of opportunity to do that. However, it's not the same scenario that Lula faced in 2003, as Thiago mentioned. It's much harder. It's more polarized. There are less agreements between political forces about public policies. We should not forget that between 1994 and 2014, at least, there were like two main parties fighting for the presidency, the Workers' Party and the Social Democratic Party. They actually had like some common ground, right? About rights, about public policies. Although they were always competing, there were some basic stuff they agreed with, and that came from the negotiations in the late 80s, in the end of the democratic transition in Brazil. Now we don't have this anymore, right? So if you take the big picture, you can say probably that 2018 and the election of Bolsonaro marked the end of this era in the new republic in Brazil that started in 1988 and lasted until 2018. Now we have a new right, we have an extreme right, and they are fighting for public policies. They want to dismantle some of the policies implemented during this period, and they have electoral force to do that, right? At least to fight in the public opinion for that. So it's a much more complicated situation. This is like the big picture. If you take inside the Congress, since 2015, there were changes in the internal rules of the Congress, and now the president of the chamber has gained a lot of power, especially in the last 4 years, through a mechanism we call secret budget, in which the president of the chamber can assign money to the deputies to send to their local bases. And he has the power of doing this. So the Congress has much more control about the budget than it has in the past, than it had in the past. And this limits a little bit the capacity of setting the agenda by the executive. So it's different from Lula 1 and Lula 2, and even from Dilma 1. And I think that Lula will have to develop new tools to bargain with the Congress, and we'll probably have to concede more. The support to Lula now is going to cost more than the support to Lula back in the beginning of 2000s. So I think that this first 6 months, they are going to be crucial for the government in many areas. And related to antipetismo, I don't think antipetismo is like a parliamentary thing. And I think it's much more a public opinion phenomenon, electoral phenomenon. It's related to identity. It is becoming super strong and attached to a group of people. So people, we can say today, right, that people, they firstly connect to each other by not being Napatista. So it's pretty much it's not pretty much like in the US, but it's more similar to the US than we had in the past. So being Napatista or being an antipatista, it's a very strong feeling, but it's more concentrated in the electoral ground. It's more concentrated like among ordinary people, at least in the beginning. Of course, when you're approaching election, deputies are going to be worried about it. So that's why I think it's not going to be a big problem in the beginning, because most of the congressmen are willing to negotiate if Lula delivers something for them, and Lula has this room. But in the first year, he'll have to deliver something. He'll have to show the signs of how the government is going to act and what he's going to offer to the Congress in exchange of support. So to end my first talk here, I'd like to say that I don't think we are going to go back to the status quo that we have, like the old coalitional presidentialism that we have. Like, we can divide power by conceding ministries. We have the budget to deal with congressmen. It's different now because the president has less power. The executive has less power than it had in the past. And the legislative has more power, and the president of the chamber especially has more power than it had in the past. So I think it's going to be something in the middle, right? And I think we are going to watch the development of new tools that I honestly don't know what's going to be, but the development of new tools to divide power in this environment that, as you mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, you have to do that, right? So even if we had, like in 2003, it was, we didn't have a PT government, it was a coalition, right? And the PT had to concede many times in many public policies. Now it's going to be even more, right? Even more. That's what I think that the government's probably going to focus in a couple of key issues and public policies and conceding many other areas. So this is what I think about the beginning of the government and the relationship with the Congress. And of course, it's a much riskier environment for Lula than it was in 2003. He would have to put much more effort to build some sort of legislative shield against impeachments and other things than he had in the past.
Thanks, Osvaldo. So Thiago, you can come in on this too. So Osvaldo, you kind of said you don't know what the new tools are, but I think you said something interesting there in the sense that, you know, I think most of us and all of us know, you know, Tim Power always wrote about the president's toolbox, right? So as you said, the president's toolbox. So how do you govern in Brazil? How does any president govern in Brazil? You know, and Thiago, you referred to it as horse trading, but it's carefully selecting who your cabinet is, and you build your coalition that way. The second tool is money, giving out money. We can't remember some of the other tools in terms of the state governors as well. You bring on certain projects to bring on state governors. So as Osvaldo said, this is the first time we're seeing it, and you kind of framed it nicely of kind of the end of the new republic, 1988 to 2018. So for us as political scientists, it also means, as you said, that the president's toolbox has to change, and they need new tools because the Congress has more, they can't control the budget as much. And also, I think Brazilian society is polarized around the use of that horse trading, and which is pork barrel politics and using money to build a coalition. So, you know, Thiago, I was wondering if you could comment on that too. And that brings in the next issue I was going to introduce, which is the fiscal context. But before we get to that, do you have any idea, Thiago, of what kind of, you know, how does Lula become popular again when he doesn't have the ability to use the tools that the president in Brazil has used from 1988 to 2018? Like what possibly could be some of those tools, even from an institutional perspective? Thiago?
Yeah, so I agree with Oswald. And also, I think to answer that, I believe that I think what is crucial, I think what will depend on Lula governing with the force that comprised his broad democratic front, which gave him the victory in the end, in the election. Instead of governing to please the factions, for example, within his party, the Workers' Party. I think this will make the difference. It cannot be a government of PT. It will have to be a government of the forces that united against the radical right in Brazil. So in other words, having won the first battle of removing a radical right president, the great challenge now for Lula is to govern with the broad front comprised of political force from the left and right of the political spectrum. That's how I see it. And I think regarding your question about how Lula became like this popular leader again, well, he was always a popular leader, but like how he was able to win this election. I think Lula has been the only candidate who has shown the ability to stop Bolsonaro and the radical right in Brazil. So a series of candidates tried during the election campaigns to position themselves as a third way, but they failed. And during the campaign, Lula systematically bet on nostalgia for his successful governments between 2003 and 2010. And Lula also maintained his former popularity among the poorest strata of the country and the voters of the northeast of Brazil. So these are the biggest beneficiaries of the social policies of the previous Lula administrations. And they were loyal to Lula. So I can share really quickly, like with you, two figures. One is this one, showing the vote share in the second round for president by region. And this is the votes for the Northeast region of Brazil. That's the only place, by the way, that Lula had the more than 50% of the shares. And so I think, moreover, and maybe even most important factor here is the fact that Lula created a broad front in the center, recruiting for his campaign the third place candidate in the presidential race in the first round, the Senator Simone Tebet, in adding to winning the support of former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso that beat Lula in the presidential elections of 1994 and 1998. So in sum, Lula won votes even from former PT critics or opponents and was able to gather the votes of those that, although not core supporters of Lula, they voted for Lula out of rejection of Bolsonaro and the radical right. So I think the critical point here in the government that we're going to see in 2023 is a government that will reflect this broad front, that will be comprised of different actors that before this election were actually opponents of Lula, instead of having just a government of PT. So I think these are my points here.
Okay, but if we think about what Osvaldo said, and Osvaldo, I was wondering if you could talk about this, because it's a really important point in terms of this election is the closest we've ever seen. But as you said, this is not a close election between two parties with similar policy platforms. So this is a polarization. The polarization in Brazil right now is, as you said, Osvaldo, is also over policy directions. It's really society is split, but it's not just society. The bureaucracy is also polarized. And so from a policy perspective, what kind of policies, what kind of policies are feasible at this current time that Lula can introduce to somehow it's a huge question. How do you reunite Brazil? What kind of policies can, it's not 2003. There's also not the fiscal capacity. So I was going to talk about that later, but Brazil's also not had any economic growth for a decade. Okay, so we've got low economic growth. We've got 75 to 80% of public sector debt to GDP. Okay, so for comparative purposes, in Australia, we talk about having an all-time high public debt to GDP, which is currently 38%. In emerging countries, it's normally supposed to be benchmarked around 60. And Brazil's is currently hovering, I believe, around 78%. And you've got an all-time low GDP of about 2%. So I know some Brazilian economists says that, that public sector debt to GDP is okay as long as the economy starts growing again. But I guess what I'm saying, within those fiscal constraints, Lula can't start expanding social spending. He can't really, from an economic perspective, he's always used the minimum wage to basically unite Brazil. But if he increases the minimum wage, I understand it's going to increase inflation, and inflation then is going to have that impact of stagnating economic growth. So I don't really see he has much room from a policy perspective to unite Brazil. I don't know really where he's going to go. Osvaldo, do you have any thoughts there about how?
Yeah, that's a very easy question. How to reunite the country? They have been working on that for the last 2 weeks. Well, I just wanted to say just a couple of things about your comments before, talking about this new ways and these new tools. And you mentioned the work of Team Power, and there are some works on that. Lula had the manual. I think Tim uses this exactly the same expression, right? That there was a manual, and he knew how to do it. He decided not to do it, and that's the tricky question in 2003. But then he moved and started to play by the book, right? And we can ask ourselves, well, if we have these new rules regarding the budget and the internal organization of the Congress for at least like 3 or 4 years, why don't we have a manual? Because Bolsonaro didn't care. Bolsonaro didn't care about public policies. Bolsonaro didn't care about doing anything. He said, I think it was like around 2019, when the beginning of 2020, when pandemic was growing, and he started to feel that he could be impeached. And he said to Arthur Lira, okay, do whatever you want. I'm not going to fight over the budget with you if you provide me the support I need to finish my government and maybe to be reelected. So he didn't negotiate it with the Congress in the end, right? He basically negotiated in the last year a couple of measures that also became the election totally unfair, right? He spent around 20 billion US dollars in the last 3 months, right? Increasing Bolsa Família, now called Auxílio Brasil, and giving credit to the people, to the poor people, and with other measures. So this was the only thing he actually had to negotiate, and Congress was willing to negotiate that because it was important for the Congress to be to have a good perspective of re-election as well. So he didn't care. So we don't have the manual. I would say that maybe it's going to be about policies, right? Lula is going to say, I want to do this and that, and these are the most important policies. I want to invest. I'm not going to go over, let's say, gender issues. I'm not going to go over this social conservative agenda. And I promise you that. And I'm not going to challenge much the new powers the Congress acquired. So, because this is the only thing he can offer right now, right? He doesn't have the control of the amount of control about the budget that he had before. So pork is no longer a big option than it was in the past, and it's not anymore, right? So I think it's going to be about policies in the sense that policies that he will promote and policies he will not promote, right? So this is what I would like to say about your comments. There are a few questions. You asked about Lula's popularity, and I think this is very interesting because I don't know if people abroad have this idea, but Lula has always been popular, right? Even when he was in jail. I remember we made a poll survey in 2018 in June. He was jailed by the time, and we asked what people thought about the trial, and most of the people said it was unfair, even before the scandals, right? Regarding the trial itself, the partiality of the judge and the prosecutors, and their collusion. So Lula has always been popular, and this is very important because this is why Bolsonaro in the end lost the election, this unfair election. Thinking like in retrospective, only Lula could have won. Any other candidate would probably have lost the election, especially after all this economic electoral cycle that we had in the last 6 months, right? So he has always been popular, but he, of course, has a lot of rejection, right? He has a very strong rejection, and that's why we are like in this polarized situation. We are probably going to talk more about this later, but Bolsonaro was a really bad president. He was the first president to lose being an incumbent in Brazil since re-election was approved in late 1990s. The management of the pandemic was really bad. There was a huge economic crisis until the beginning of this year. There was an increase in the poverty. We have now like 30 million people that cannot eat properly every day, right? So even making the election very unfair, he in the end lost the election, and this was because on the other side was Lula, who had a good recall, right? And I think you actually asked this about this to Thiago. I think we don't have that kind of divided society that the votes they think we have. Like, so I remember when you asked me to join this panel, it was probably in the second half of October, like around 20. I was pretty sure that Lula was going to win by like 5 or 7 points. So I was really happy to join. And then in the end, it was really close. I was worried, oh my God, I'm going to have a seminar next week and I'll have to talk about Bolsonaro winning. That's going to be really bad. But I think that we have like 20, 25% or 30% that support a more progressive agenda. This progressive agenda that comes from like the 1988 Constitution and the idea of having a more social democratic country in the way that Europeans think. We have like 30% now that they are not afraid anymore of saying they are right-wing, something that we had in the past, like the ashamed right-wing, right? The ashamed right, as a direita envergonhada, as we used to say in Portuguese. They are not afraid of saying they are right-wing. They support liberal, meritocratic policies. They think like quotas and other policies are distorting the public policies in Brazil. And they are also super conservative in social issues like gay marriage, abortion, death penalty, and other things. And we have like 30% who don't care. Poor voters, they don't care. They care about their everyday life. Right? So they swing. And I think that in the beginning, they were like saying, well, this is Bolsonaro, this is Lula. My life under Lula was much better, right? So I'll probably vote for him. But in the last year, with this electoral economic cycle, they started to rethink about this. Well, it's not that bad. He increased the Bolsa Familia or the Auxílio Brasil. He had given us more credit, and there were other social policies, or we cannot even call it social policies. There were other measures trying to make their lives better. So they thought, well, maybe we should be with this guy again, and that's why I think the race was so close in the end, right? So I think that Lula has to deal with the Congress, and I don't know if I can bring this fiscal thing. Well, you're going to ask later, but I think that Lula has. I think probably the first thing he's going to address is the spending rules. We have the rules we have now that have not been followed constantly during the last 3 years, by the way. They do not allow the amount of investment we need to secure the rights and the public services written in the Constitution of '88. They are super strict, right? State needs to invest more, at least in the next 1 or 2 years. Even liberal economists, like those that are now supporting Lula, such as the guys who created the stabilization plan, like André Lara Rezende, Pércio Arida, even Armínio Fraga was the head of central bank during Cardoso's administration. We are saying, no, we have to have new rules for spending. We should allow the state to invest more. It needs to invest more, right? Of course, they are going to have to pay attention in inflation, but perhaps if they expand investment in the sense that we have more production, these can compensate. And if we have more predictability, perhaps we are going to have more foreign investment, what makes the dollar goes down and also helps to secure the inflation. So these are the things I think Lula is going to concentrate first. New spending rules and tax reforms. It's amazing. We have not been able to do tax reforms in 30 years of the new republic. They are super regressive, as you know, more better than I do. to give the audience an example, formal employees in Brazil, they pay more taxes than bankers, right? Relatively, of course. So taxes, they penalize middle class, they make business harder to do. So these are two things that can improve the economic in such a medium term. And I think those two things are going to be the first two things the government is going to address, because poverty alleviation is going to be the main goal, right? Poverty alleviation. And to do that, the government will need more money than it has today. So I'll stop with that.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to Thiago, but Osvaldo's opened some really, again, we have to unite Brazil, but now we put tax reform on the table, which, as Osvaldo says, is something that nobody, even in the days when people, when Congress was controlled by the PT, tax reform, and also for those of you that may not know, pension reform in Brazil is something that that desperately needs reforming. And it is never been touched and is almost impossible. And anybody who's tried is quickly turned the other way because it's so difficult. So before we and I'm going to open up for questions soon, because we're coming up to, maybe I'll do this as a last round. But Thiago, I was wondering if you could comment on all that, but also if Thiago, if maybe you could touch on in this new political situation and in the new limits of executive dominance in this context in Brazil, if you could maybe touch on which policy areas Lula has the most ability to impact, because as Osvaldo said, social policy is probably a bit of a deep hole right now, in terms, there's also been a massive dismantling of the Brazilian bureaucracy. There's fiscal constraints. So, we could talk about which reforms are necessary, like tax and pension. But for the here and now, coming in January, if you think about, the first 100 days of Lula's government, let's put it that way, which are the policy areas which he actually has the ability to make the biggest impact on, in the fiscal context we have now, in the first 100 days, to kind of avoid becoming, the next bad president and the next impeachment? I don't know if you understand my question. You probably do. But what do you think, Thiago?
Yeah, so, well, there are many challenges, right, in the country's economic situation and the public service provision. First, the economic legacy of Bolsonaro's government is very negative. So the transition team of the president-elected Lula is beginning to have an idea of the size of the problem left by the mismanagement of the Bolsonaro government and his Minister of Economy, Paulo Guedes. So according to the former president of the Central Bank and former Minister of Finance, Henrique Meirelles, who supported Lula against Bolsonaro in the elections, Lula might get a country with a fiscal hole of around 400 million reais. So I think that the main challenges are keeping a fiscal balance, developing education policy that addresses the gaps generated during the isolation of the pandemic, and the quest for pacification that you and Osvaldo already mentioned. But in this case, there's a particular division and needs for pacification that is between the agribusiness sector and the environmental activists in Brazil. So I think another urgent challenge for Lula, and this I think it will start, like it already started, by the way, is to redo the budget proposal for 2023. I think this is crucial because it will be necessary to increase the resource initially planned for the budget by about 2% of GDP, is approximately 200 billion. And these resources are necessary to make the Bolsa Família, or Auxílio Brasil, the cash transfer policy, viable for families in conditions of extreme poverty that Osvaldo mentioned already, to increase the minimum wage above inflation, and to restore resources for the reindustrialization of the country and other public policies such as the housing program initiated in the first Lula's government. So far, the good news is there seems to be some convergence between the proposals of the elected president and the political leaders of the parties with representation in the lower chamber to start in 2023. I think it's still the main challenges are yet to come, and that is the negotiation between those from inside Lula's party and other supporters more to the left side in the political spectrum that advocate for a more significant state intervention to accelerate economic growth in the short term, and those supporters of Lula more orthodox in the management of the economy that defend less state intervention, fiscal balance, and the role of the private sector lead economic growth. So it is from this tension within the new government that the financial and public policy proposal will emerge in the new Lula government to start in 2023. And going precisely to the question about the policies, I'm not optimistic about policies related, for example, to the thing that Oswaldo already mentioned, such as, how can I say, related to topics that we can see that the population of Brazil has actually supported Bolsonaro for those things. You know, this rhetoric about the traditional family, you know, about, unfortunately, not very progressive in terms of gender equality, you know, so I'm not very optimistic about this policy, to be honest. I think the main change that we'll see initially from the first months of Lula's government will be related to the management of the economy. And it has to do with the budget of 2023 particularly, you know, so I think that's what we're going to see in the first year at least.
I'd like to thank you both. Muito obrigada. It's been a stimulating 90 minutes. I hope the audience has enjoyed it. It's been a great update. I hope we can do this every year. It'd be nice to do a Brazil update every year. Now that Thiago's joined us at the ANU. Thank you, Osvaldo, for your time. I'm sure you've been very busy in the last few weeks. So thank you to you both. And we're very happy as well with the results and hope that the transition is as smooth as we all expect. Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody for participating.